All right, let's get into it. Enough shenanigans. Hear that, universe? Enough shenanigans. All right. So Qatari Investment Fund becomes the first ever foreign wealth fund to buy into a major American sport. It is a 5% buy-in from what I read in your reporting. It is a non-controlling interest. What does all that ultimately mean? And what are we talking about here?
It just means it's a huge pool of capital that is now going over to Monumental. From what I understand, everybody, Ted Leonsis, all of the LPs are all getting diluted equally. But if you do the math, the 5% of 4.05, it's a $200 million check that the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund is cutting to Monumental. Gives them an equity piece. You're right. It's the first time a direct investment from a sovereign wealth fund into a major U.S. team gives them an equity piece. And if this were to sell at some point in the future, or they wanted to sell theirs, they'd capture the appreciation. It does not mean that the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund has any say in what happens with the Wizards, or with the Capitals. Passive, as you said, is the key word here, at least for now. All of these institutional capital deals, and we can talk about, Craig, the private equities and the endowment funds of the world, because they're in and are getting into the NBA as well. But all of these things are non-controlled, no board seat, no voting, just passive investment.
So why do they do it? Because if I have $200 million, I'm not just like looking to give it to another rich guy.
Yeah. So think about this is a sovereign wealth fund that has $500 billion, right? So it is not as though they are struggling to find places to put their money. On the Monumental side, you and I have talked about this a lot. The sheer valuation increase for teams in every professional U.S. league, but particularly in the NFL and NBA, just means that buying into it, even buying a 5% stake in Monumental, cost you $200 million, right? There's not that many rich people in the world that have $200 million of cash that they're willing to just park in an asset like this. So the pool of people that can help Ted, help Monumental take money off the table if needed, is getting smaller and smaller. And as a result, leagues like the NBA and the NHL and Major League Baseball are all changing their rules so that they can find more buyers. And one way you can find more buyers is if you let sovereign wealth funds like the Qatar Investment Authority, if you let endowments like the Harvard University Endowment, if you let institutional capital buy in, suddenly you've created the impetus is no longer you need to have a rich human. You can have a rich pool of capital. And again, that opens the opportunities up in a much, much larger way.
Right. I get it from that side. Like for the Qataris, I'm playing dumb here, but like, why do the Qataris want in? Like they could put this $200 million to a lot of places. Why do they want to be in American sports?
I'll toss out a few possibilities there, right? And sports washing we have to mention in this conversation, right? There's a lot of people who feel as though rich foreign governments are using their money to buy influence and buy good PR, right? So, and I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but there's a lot of people who look at investments made by PIF, the Saudi Arabian sovereign wealth fund that you mentioned, and QIA and other sovereign wealth funds around the world as ways of kind of laundering their image. And in that regard, this is a very high profile investment, right? The Capitals and the Wizards, two of the biggest, richest sports leagues globally in the world, a different fund, but Qatar government also working their way down. A different fund owns Paris Saint-Germain, one of the biggest soccer clubs in the world. There's a lot of influence that you get in owning big teams like this. I also think I am not surprised that DC is the first place to do this, right? I think if you are a foreign government, if you have big investments in a capital city, I do think that is also valuable, right? And QIA owns City Center, a big development in downtown DC, right next to Capital One Arena. The QIA obviously already has a lot of business interests in DC, but you know as well as I do, this is close to the power structure, right? Congressmen, congresswomen, senators, Supreme Court justices, they go to sporting events in DC. And I can imagine that proximity to all of that is potentially actually really valuable and really enticing for QIA. So I think there's a number of possibilities as to why. And then the simplest, Craig, could just be that it's a good way to make more money, right? The sheer value appreciation that we've looked at in the NHL and in the NBA, teams that were selling for hundreds of millions now are selling for $4 billion, right? In the case of the Phoenix Suns. This has been a fairly ironclad way over the past 20 or 30 years to rapidly make more money than you had at the start.
Eben Novy-Williams from Sportico is with us here on the Hoffman Show. So I will focus on the sports washing as something that we have spent a lot of time on in this show, specifically about Qatar, because leading into the 2022 World Cup, it deserved a lot of attention because that World Cup was bought. It was built out of nothing by migrant workers, somewhere between 500 and 5,000 of which died. And my guess would be it's a lot closer to the 5,000 number. And they obviously would like to be known for not only not that, but their human rights record on how they treat women, how they treat the LGBT community, how they treat any number of people who are not super rich Qatari men specifically. So if you're Ted Leonsis and you're Adam Silver, who, by the way, was on the NBA's float at Pride in New York this weekend, like, how do you justify this?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, right? And obviously everyone involved in this deal understood that there was going to be backlash to it when it came out. This is not a deal you do in a vacuum and think everybody is going to love it. And to be totally honest, Greg, I am surprised that the first sovereign wealth fund to invest in U.S. sports is from Qatar. As you said, there's a whole wealth of information out there about human rights concerns in Qatar. Same with Saudi Arabia. Same with China. Right. I was kind of expecting this to happen from a different country first, and then maybe evolve into some of the more potentially controversial deals. One thing I will say about sovereign wealth, and I do think it's interesting in this conversation, a lot of these many sovereign wealth funds are invested in the exact same private equity funds that are already buying into these leagues, right? And so many big time sports owners have other businesses that they partner with sovereign wealth funds on, right? And there are sovereign wealth funds that own a whole lot of American equities. Some of those, like MSG Sports or Liberty Media, are team owners. There's sovereign wealth funds that are invested in huge companies in our orbit, right? So CAA and Fanatics. There's sovereign wealth money everywhere in American sports already before this deal happened. What makes this deal so unique is the proximity between the sovereign wealth fund and the team, right? It's not investing in a fund that's then investing along. It's not investing in a company that does a lot of work with these. It's not investing in an owner's other business. It is directly investing in the team. And it is the press release and the announcement that is the QIA logo and the Monumental logo right next to each other. So we've talked a lot at Sportico about just how different this is, right? If there's so much sovereign wealth money already in American sports, how notable is it that this deal happened in this way? And that's the thing that I think really sticks out to me, is that if you do believe that the real motive here is to get a lot of publicity for doing this investment, there's no way to get more publicity than to invest directly into the team, as opposed to all the other ways that sovereign wealth money is circulating around American sports right now.
Right. I don't know if they're going to get the kind of attention they want on the announcement.
Which is something that Adam Silver, he was asked, I don't know if you caught this, but about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, after the PGA Live announcement came out, Adam was asked about that and what it might mean for sovereign wealth funds investing in the NBA. And one of his comments was that he thinks the media does a really good job of, when we talk about big moments like the Qatar World Cup, also highlighting a lot of the things that you're talking about, right? The bad things that are happening in those countries. So certainly the way that Adam thinks about it, I think partially is that, not that allowing them to invest is allowing a bigger spotlight to be shown, but I think he does feel as though the conversation can be very balanced around these deals, because it is in some ways calling attention to some things that, NBA fans might not be fully aware of if they're not huge soccer fans, for example.
Right. Eben Novy-Williams with us from Sportico. Let's take even a further step back, though, Eben. How does a sovereign wealth fund wind up with $500 billion in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I imagine for Qatar, it's largely oil money. But this is, I think, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world is the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. So obviously there are governments all over the world that have set these up. And it's a way, from what I understand, one of the big things for a lot of Middle Eastern governments right now is trying to diversify their economies off of oil. Right, they're very exposed to one very lucrative, at least so far, one very lucrative product. And I think one of the reasons why you see PIF in Saudi Arabia, why you see QIA in Qatar really getting very aggressive in investing in a lot of art, sports teams, entertainment, other businesses, technology, whatever you want it to be, is that I think the government wants its exposure to be a little bit more broad than just oil. Right. And I think that is one of the interesting parts of particularly around the countries like Qatar and like Saudi Arabia, is that a lot of this, from what I understand, is taking money that was probably taken via oil and trying to use it just to diversify their businesses, so that in 20 or 30 years, if the world is way less reliant on oil than it was, or if the oil dries up for whatever reason, that the economy doesn't just fully grind to a halt.
So I hear you on that, but I guess like the Norway one's interesting because that's a Nordic society where like people generally pretty happy. There's a lot of rights, like they do well. You know, the average citizen's doing all right. Versus, and like the definition of citizenship, from what I know, is not nearly as narrow as what it is in Qatar, for instance, where like most of the people that actually live in Qatar are not considered citizens, which allows you to do all kinds of manipulation in terms of the numbers and the math. And part of the reason that they have that foreign wealth fund and the money is big is because the people who actually do the work to harvest that oil don't probably get paid like a living wage. And like there's a lot of corruption, whether you call it corruption or just an economic system that doesn't serve anybody but the top. And thus it's like, oh, wow, look at all this money. It's like, well, yeah, if you don't pay anybody and your general state of living for most people in the country is crap, like, yeah, it's pretty easy when you keep it all. And I guess that's kind of what I'm asking too, is like, who are they? Like, is it possible that any foreign wealth fund is something that, if we're, I don't even want to get too deep in the politics of like, what are American ideals these days anyway? But like, if we think of the most generic, like safe version that everybody can agree on, that people should have rights and that, you know, people should get paid fair wages and like the kinds of things that would theoretically go into a generic milquetoast politician stump speech. Like, is there a sovereign wealth fund that exists that would be kosher to do business with along those grounds? Or is saying that they'll get into business with anybody that is a sovereign wealth fund already going to bring up a litany of moral problems that these leagues are basically punting on in the name of money?
I mean, I think, Craig, you're asking all the, and these are questions that Adam and I'm sure Ted Leonsis are going to be getting a lot in the next few weeks.
By the way, Ted, if you're listening, I'm happy to ask them to you.
It feels, I mean, honestly, some of this kind of sounds like a lot of the backlash the NBA got in China a few years ago, right? Another country that has its own kind of litany of human rights violations and concerns. And this is the challenge that all businesses, I would say, but just because we're talking about sports here, I think all these sports leagues that are doing these deals are going to need to face, right? And they're going to need to be able to talk about them. And when the NBA, it was about a year ago, essentially changed its rules on institutional money to include sovereign wealth funds. One of the things I kept hearing from folks at the NBA was, look, this doesn't mean any sovereign wealth fund can do deals. They're going to be on a case-by-case basis. We're going to look at each one. And again, that one of the reasons why I was kind of surprised that QIA would be the first one. But does that mean that PIF could buy into 20% of the Indiana Pacers, or that a sovereign wealth fund from China could buy into the New York Knicks? I have no idea. I think it'll be interesting to see if there is a line that the NBA wants to draw. But the league has kind of always said, to your point about whether there's a moral authority out here, they've kind of always kept the option of at some point saying, just because we're open to this money doesn't mean we're going to accept all of it whenever or if ever an owner wants to take it.
Yeah, it's just such a slippery slope. And like the question I would ask Ted specifically is something on the lines of like, what do you tell Natasha Cloud? One of the most outspoken advocates, one of the most outspoken, and I say outspoken here as a compliment, fighters for civil rights in sports in America. A black queer woman who has been very vocal about her blackness, her queerness, her everything else that makes her a persona non grata in Qatar. And the fact that the Qataris would probably roll out a red carpet for her because she wears a Washington Mystics uniform doesn't change how they would treat her if she didn't. And so I think that is kind of the moral conundrum and the slippery slope here. And the question that these leagues ultimately have to ask is like, where is our line? Because if you're doing business, bluntly, if you're doing business with the Qataris, like you've already put the line in a place that's potentially damaging to, if you're talking about the NBA, like a large percent of the WNBA, for instance, and certainly many of their fans and many people who have supported your league for the last 25 years, but the NBA as well.
I'll give you and there's definitely some cynicism to this, but the line that I have heard a lot from other owners and investors and people who work in finance side in this industry is that a lot of people don't see a huge difference between, again, what I was talking about before, between this deal and having a private equity fund that is largely backed by sovereign wealth buying in. And again, I think that is you can look at that as a very kind of strict economic or very business focused way of looking at this. But yeah, I think there's a lot of people, and I won't obviously speak for Ted. I have not talked to Ted about this, but I would think there's a lot of people who kind of view this as more or less the same, right? That it is there's a little bit more proximity to it. But again, that sovereign wealth is all over the American economy. It's all over American sports. And this is just one more very public way of doing it. I would also imagine there's a lot of NBA owners who are really glad that they're not going to be the first one to do this.
Yeah.
Right. And if they're talking to Mubadala or talking to Temasek or the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, whatever other sovereign wealth fund it is, I think that the outcry is probably, and again, I think you and I would agree, there's going to be a lot more deals like this.
For sure.
American sports in the next few years.
Look, I'm not trying to be obtuse either, because as a country, it's just the difference between as a country, we can't not deal with China because they've done some terrible stuff. It's not an option in American foreign policy, but it's different when you're a private business doing things and it's just like, hey, we're willing to take the money because, well, it's a lot of money. And, also, in reading some of the reporting about this, the Qataris are going to put in hundreds of thousands of dollars into the youth of DC. And that's great. And so there's trade-offs here. I guess it's trade-offs. I'm not trying to be obtuse. It's just I think it's important to ask the questions on the edges to try to understand where those lines are. And I think you've done a good job of explaining it, that these lines are already very blurry because of some of the ways in which money is channeled into sports already that we just might not know about and are not quite as direct.
One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, at what point do I think, if ever, a sovereign wealth fund is allowed to buy a control stake in an American sports franchise? And all of the leagues that have made this change about institutional capital in the past few years, they've all made it very clear. These are passive minority stakes. None of them can be over 20% of a franchise, all of those things. But again, if the current trend lines hold, who says that in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, whatever it is, who says that at some point the economic argument for, suddenly now the way to keep valuations increasing is to allow control stake trades, right? Which as trade at a higher premium than a 5% stake of Monumental would. I do wonder, again, and this is way down the line, but if at some point, and who would be the first, if a major U.S. league at some point says, we already have sovereign wealth fund on cap tables and 25 of our 32 teams, why not expand the pool of what they're allowed to do a little bit more? Right.
Last thing, completely unrelated, 60 seconds or so before we're out of here. What changed so that Josh Harris is going to get to buy the Commanders on July 20th? Do you have any idea what the final things were?
It certainly looks good. I don't have too much firm inside information. The impression that I have gotten from talking to people in and around the deal is that the NFL, I think maybe to its credit, stood pretty firm on some of the requirements it had. You and I have talked, Craig, about this push and pull of the NFL really wants Dan Snyder to no longer own the Washington Commanders, and whether that was going to potentially allow Josh to come in with a financing package that under normal circumstances might have been a little bit stretching the boundaries of what the NFL was comfortable with. From what I understand, the NFL has been fairly firm throughout about what it was requiring. And from what I understand, there have been a few changes to what Josh was doing. I don't know exactly what those were, and I don't know the full extent of it. And maybe they did just meet in the middle, but My general feeling is that I believe Josh made a few changes to the financing of his bid, and it got it to a point where the NFL was happy with it. I was never kind of in doubt that this deal wasn't going to get done, but it certainly seems like in the next 3 weeks, we're going to have a new owner.
Yeah. Once we get the details, we'll have you back. Eben Novy-Williams, everybody, reporting on all things sports business and Sportico, broke the news about the Qatari investment in Monumental. I'm very glad your internet and this radio show eventually cooperated. Thank you for your time, as always.
I hope the show improves after I'm gone. Enjoy.
Me too. Thanks, buddy. See ya.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.